Daddy's Little Owner. Chapter 12. The Block. Dad's attitude towards me seemed to be changing as I matured, becoming more sinister and suggestive. He was beginning to see me more as a grown woman than as a child. It was as if I was some part of some fantasy life he was living in his head, part of some plan that he was brooding over. Once I was 12, we were back home from the school and we were invited to a party with him and Kathy. Dad insisted on dressing me up like a tart, in tight red dress that belonged to Kathy's daughter, and talked me into getting all done up, my face painted with makeup and my hair done in an adult style, behaving like he had the time he persuaded Lucy to dress me up when I was 9. To begin with, I was excited to see how grown up I looked, but then I started to feel less comfortable about it. I tried to back away a bit, but he insisted I kept the dress and makeup on, saying he wanted to make me look 18 for the evening. It wasn't that difficult to make me look how he wanted. I was quite mature for my age and had developed boobs before any of my mates did. In the right dress, I more than looked the part. When we got to the party, Dad started acting even more strangely, more like he was my boyfriend than my father, all mauling hands, leering looks and suggestive comments. It creeped me out, but I couldn't say anything without risking sending him off into a rage in front of everyone else, so I just grinned, kept my eyes on the floor and put up with the embarrassment. There had been times before when he had done or said things that didn't seem appropriate between a father and daughter, apart from the obvious abuse, of course. But this seemed more threatening somehow, because there were other people around, and he didn't seem to care if they saw or what they thought. It was as though he was flaunting me in front of everyone. He'd given me a birthday card on my 12th birthday, and I was so thrilled that he remembered. I'd never had a card from him before. But the message written inside it was for my darling Maria, which sounded more like it was from a lover than a father, and made me feel sick without really knowing why. This performance gave me the same feeling. The day after the party, he was still acting weird, and he announced he wanted to take me to show me something. I dutifully trotted off behind him, as I always did, happy that he was actually talking to me and being a bit like a proper father. I suppose I hoped he was going to show me something that I would enjoy, like a fun fair, or that he was going to take me to the shops and buy me something nice. It was hard to stay optimistic after so many years, but I kept trying. As he led me up towards the block where all the prostitutes worked, my heart began to sink. I didn't know exactly what he was showing me, but I knew it was something to do with his grown-up interests rather than my childish ones, and something to do with sex. The main street on the block is called Burr Street, which is just outside the central shopping area of Norwich. That was where the better class of streetwalkers plied their trade. Further on was King Street, the haunt of girls who might have drug problems or be from out of town, having come from Ipswich or somewhere similar and been able to get a pitch in Burr Street without being set upon by the local girls. He proudly told me this was where Mum and Lucy and Gail and the others had worked, and that he wanted to show me what I would be doing when I was ready to start work. There were a couple of pubs on the block where the girls and their pimps all used to drink in those days, and where Dad was a well-known local figure. Most kids get to visit their father's offices, shops or factories, or get to admire their computers or company cars. But Burr Street was Dad's little kingdom, and he laid it before me like it was some wonderful prize, as if I would be excited at the thought of being able to work there myself one day soon. Some of the girls were out looking for business when we got there, loitering around waiting for customers. They all seemed to know Dad and chatted to him as he went past. No doubt they were eyeing me up as a potential competitor. There was a real camaraderie amongst them all, but that didn't surprise me because I'd already experienced it at home with girls like the scary Gail and the wonderful Lucy. 3 years earlier, when Dad had made Lucy dress me up, I had decided I didn't want to be a prostitute, not even to please Dad. And by the time he took me out to show me the block, I was even more certain it wasn't where I wanted to end up. It all seemed sordid and frightening, even with Dad there to protect me. But I wasn't brave enough to say anything. If I had suggested I wasn't going to go along with his plan, he would have either have become angry and given me a beating, or he would have laughed at me for being so stupid and babyish, or he would simply have ignored me and talked over my protests as if I wasn't there. Maybe if I'd gone to the social services at that stage and told them exactly what he'd planned for me, they would have removed me there and then. But I didn't want to be removed from my family home any more than I wanted to be made to work on the streets. I wanted to be with Dad and Kathy and Terry, so I kept quiet and just hoped that he would change his mind about sending me up the block. Kathy was the first person that I told about what Dad was doing to me whenever he had the chance, and it was her who informed on him to the social services, despite her own fear of him. Even if she hadn't drawn the line at going on the street herself for him, she knew he'd overstepped the mark with me. It was also her who told the authorities that Dad had taken me up to the block and had shown me around, preparing me for the day when he would put me to work. If they had checked back through their files, they might have found the warnings that Mum had given them when she finally left home 6 years before, telling them that he had been threatening to make me a prostitute since the day I was born. I dare say none of it came as a shock to them. Everyone knew what Dad was like. But once Kathy had stepped forward and confirmed it all to them, I suppose they were forced to take it more seriously and be seen to be doing something about it. The day I told her the truth, I'd actually gone to see her in order to beg her to go back to him, because as long as she was around, he would leave me alone. I had come back from school on a weekend to find they'd split up yet again, and I was terrified of staying at home with him, on my own. As we sat together in the house, she was trying to explain to me all the reasons why she had to break up with him. The beatings, forcing her onto the game, the heavy drinking, and the bad effects he had on her children. It was all perfectly understandable from her point of view, and I admired her for having the courage to leave him. But I still kept begging her to rethink her decision. My distress must have shown, because eventually she asked me why I was so desperate for her to come back. I was still terrified of betraying him, and I really didn't want him to go back to prison on my account, but in the end I blurted it out. Eventually, I suspect every secret grows too heavy and becomes just too painful to be contained any longer. Shocked and angry, she phoned social services and they immediately moved into action. Even though she knew Dad well and had witnessed many of his depravities, Kathy was still horrified by what I was telling her and immediately agreed that I should stay with her that night rather than go home to him. I felt scared, knowing now that I had put my life in someone else's hands, believing that if Dad found out I had betrayed him, he would kill me, and maybe he'd kill Kathy as well, when he realised she'd shocked him to the authorities. I was desperately anxious about what the authorities might decide to do. I didn't want to stop seeing Dad. I just wanted him to stop forcing me to have sex with him. All weekend I felt panicky and scared, and nothing Kathy could say or do would calm me down. After that weekend I was sent back to Wymondham without seeing Dad, and the social services responded to the information Kathy had given them by coming to the school to do tests on me, wanting to gather evidence that they could use against Dad in court. The fact that they wanted to do the tests seemed to suggest they believed me, which was a relief, even though I didn't like the idea of having a doctor probing around inside me. They wanted to tell me every detail of what had happened, and then they went looking for proof to back up my story. It felt like I was losing control of my life, handing it over to the grown-ups. But of course, it was an illusion, because I never had any control, really. That had always rested in Dad's hands when he was around, and in the hands of social workers whenever he was taken away. All I ever had was a horrible secret, and now I'd given it away. If I had felt different to the other girls at school before, I felt like a complete alien now that the staff were moving discreetly into action to support me. How was I going to be able to just breeze back into class after all this and mingle with everyone else as if my life was just like theirs? I was taken to see the doctor, and to my horror, he announced after doing the tests that although there was evidence of sexual activity, my hymen was still intact. Despite all the pain Dad had inflicted every time he tried to enter me, he hadn't succeeded in taking my virginity. Despite trying to force himself into me, he had just been too big to get very far. What horrified me the most about this news was the thought that now they might not believe me, that they would think I was making it all up just to get attention. I felt desperately let down and worried about what Dad would say when I next saw him. He would be furious that I had tried to betray him, but triumph that I had failed to provide the evidence needed to prosecute him. It was the worst possible outcome. Somehow, Dad persuaded Kathy to go back to him, even when she knew all about what he'd done to me, which I found hard to understand. He then didn't bother to turn up to the next meeting with my social worker. It was as though he was showing them he didn't have to live by their small-minded rules, that he wasn't intimidated by them and all their official powers. When he did finally show up at his own convenience, he vehemently denied all the allegations I'd made. "Look how she lied about me sending her out to steal whiskey," he said. "She's evil. I don't want her back home after this." He was playing some diabolical game of mental chess with me and with the rest of the world. It was him who suggested I told them I'd lied about him making me steal the whiskey. And now he was using that false confession to prove that I was the liar. There was nothing I could say in my defence that wouldn't make me sound even worse. Sometimes he seemed to be flaunting his lifestyle in the faces of the people who tried to interrogate him, as if he was trying to show them up for being petty and small-minded, painting himself as some grand bohemian libertine, unfettered by their petty rules and morals. He admitted that because he rented 2 or 3 bedrooms out, Terry and I often slept in his bed with him. "Sometimes I might put my leg over Terry in my sleep," he told them, thinking I'm with a woman. The social services, however, were obviously coming to the conclusion that there was no smoke without fire, and even if I was still technically a virgin, it would only be a matter of time before they caught him. Dad must have realised they were closing in on him, and his depression returned. After they talked to him, Kathy rang the social worker in charge of the case to tell her that Dad had become suicidal and that he had now admitted to sending us out to steal whiskey for him. Maybe he thought that if he admitted to one thing, then they would be more likely to believe him when he denied abusing me. Or maybe he'd become too depressed to even care what happened to him anymore. It was a relief to know that he was admitting it was him who was a liar and not me. But I was worried that if he got too depressed, he might try to kill himself again. I didn't want to be the cause of that. He was still the most important person in my life, and I loved him despite everything. By then, the police were involved, and I realised it was possible Dad was going to be sent to prison yet again because of me. The staff at school and social workers kept telling me I had nothing to worry about, nothing to blame myself for, but I knew they were wrong. I walked around with a huge cloud over my head, almost wishing I'd kept my mouth shut, worrying over things constantly. The reports that teachers and social workers did about me during those years showed that they were almost as confused about what was going on in my head as I was. At one stage, my house mistress at Wymondham wrote, "Maria, in some ways, functioning at a 4 or 5-year-old level, and in others, at a 16-year-old level, plus being an intelligent 12-year-old. She then made the extraordinary statement, "Maria is over fond of her dad and wants him close to her, up to a certain point, and beyond that she starts complaining. Isn't that how a little girl should feel about her father? I loved my daddy. I just didn't want him doing those things to me. Was that so unreasonable?" There were all sorts of meetings to discuss whether Terry and I should be allowed home for weekends at all. At one stage, my grandmother offered to have Terry at her bungalow, but she didn't offer to have me, confirming my earlier feelings that she never liked me. As far as she was concerned, I was a troublemaker in the family, telling lies about her son, spreading false rumours, bringing dishonour and scandal down on all of us. She would never have been able to admit that he was capable of doing the things that I had accused him of. To complicate matters even further, Dad was in the process of being evicted from his house because the council had discovered he was subletting the rooms that were meant for us. His angle for hanging on to the house was to say that he had to have a home for his children when we came back from school. But if we weren't allowed to see him, that would undermine his argument, particularly if he was renting out the rooms. Then, in another interview, he suggested I was just trying to get back at him by making up these stories because he had bought Terry a £50 watch for his birthday, but hadn't bought me anything. It was certainly true that he had done that, but I was used to things like that. It always hurt, but it also made me more anxious to please him, more anxious to make myself a better daughter. So I would deserve to be given presents too. It certainly didn't make me want him to get sent to prison. And anyway, he said right at the end of the interview, even if I had done these things, if she really loved her dad, why would she say such a thing? Social services actually had his words down in writing, as if he was admitting that a child should not tell tales on her father if she loved him, no matter what he might have done to her. It seemed to me to be a practically cast-iron admission of guilt. While all this was going on, the authorities needed to find us somewhere else to go during school holidays. Break was a charity that had been started by a couple called Mr. and Mrs. Davidson to provide respite care for disabled children. They had 2 houses, one called Magpie and one called Rainbow. Magpie had become a general children's home, and the council decided to send Terry and me there during the holidays while we were attending Wymond College, so that we didn't have to go back to Dad. I had some of my happiest times at Break, practically when a group of us used to go down to the nearby beach where we would spend hours swimming during the summer, or just walking, or sitting and talking in the winter. We liked it better out of season when the holidaymakers had all gone home and we had the sands to ourselves. I used to go into disabled house to help feed the children who lived there. I love doing that because disabled people don't judge you. They just accept you for who you are. I never felt they were looking at me and wondering what I was doing there, or thinking that I didn't belong, or looking down at me. I felt by helping them, I was making up a little for being such a crap person the rest of the time. By the time Terry and I were at break, the Davidsons had opened a third house, and the whole operation was starting to develop into the huge charity it is today. But even though they were giving me the happiest times I'd ever experienced, whenever I spoke to Dad on the phone, he nagged me to run away and come back to him. And so, finally, I did. It might be hard to understand, but I'd missed him. And I'd been so upset about betraying him and worried that he might not forgive me, that I was really happy when he phoned and asked me to come home. I was nervous about the reception I might get, but he didn't seem to hold it against me that I'd told Kathy about what he was doing to me, or that he might end up in prison for it. He just seemed to accept it as being part of life. I was so relieved that he still wanted to see me and felt so guilty about betraying him that I would do whatever he asked. I didn't want to accept the help that was being offered by everyone else. My opinion of myself was so low that even when people showed a genuine concern for my welfare, I dismissed them as interfering busybodies who were just doing their jobs, an attitude I had learnt directly from Dad. Even at break, Terry and I were made to feel different because all the other children went to the local secondary school, while we were sent back to Wyndham College at the end of each weekend and every holiday, which meant we didn't really fit in either place. I must have been giving off a lot of contradictory signals to everyone because my social worker's reports at the time paint a very odd picture. Maria went home 23rd December, one wrote. Terry Sr. phoned, asked if Maria could stay for the weekend. Spoke to Maria also. She'd like to stay with Dad. Phoned Mrs. Davison. She agrees with Maria staying with Dad until Sunday. They've all been staying at Kathy's house, which means the likelihood of Terry and Maria indulging in any sort of sexual activity is that much less. Whether they did in the past is debatable, and it's a risk that has to be taken since Maria will never be content anywhere unless she can see her father. I saw it as him raping me. They saw it as a pair of us indulging in sexual activity. It seemed like they thought I had as much to do with instigating it as he did. By constantly running back to him, I was making it look like I was asking for it. I suppose, but that wasn't how I saw it. I might have been guilty of some poor judgments when it came to putting myself in dangerous situations with him, but he was an adult who should have known better, and I was a child in need of protection. I wonder if the social worker involved would have been happy to send her own daughter home for the weekend with Dad, however much the girl might have wanted to go. All my life, Dad had drummed it into me that wherever the authorities took me, I should take the first opportunity to run away and go back to him. I never really questioned that wisdom, even though I sometimes knew I was better off in the places they sent me to. He was my dad. It seemed right that I should want to go back with him. It was just the way things were. At one stage, they said he could only visit me under supervision, but he wouldn't have done that. He threw a tantrum and said that if he couldn't see me on his own, he didn't want to see me at all. I guess he knew he could brainwash me better when he had me to himself. Another adult in the room at the same time would have been able to see through his manipulations, would have cramped his style. I think that, in a funny way, I broke his heart by betraying him to Kathy and the social services because he truly believed I was his property, to do with as he pleased. It was as if he was disappointed and puzzled to think that I mightn't be going to become a successful prostitute and a credit to his teaching, able to support him for the rest of his life. Maybe he felt the same way as respectable parents feel when their children decide not to become doctors or lawyers after family hopes have been raised. Not that he allowed this setback to interrupt his plans for long.